morning. I am so excited and delighted to be the opening panelist for today's Advances in Poverty Elimination Symposium, hosted by Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. I'm super excited because, you know, I consider myself to be kind of a lay person in terms of this field of equity, and especially, you know, when it comes to the academics of it all. And I find myself moderating a panel filled with experts whose work has made tremendous impact in our city and our nation. And so I'm happy that they let this little culturalist come along and host you in the discussion. So I am Asali Devon Ecclesiastes. I'm the Chief Equity Officer at the Ashe Cultural Arts Center in Central City here in New Orleans. And our panel today poses that racism, poverty, and their outcomes are institutional, and systemically designed into our society. Our panelists will explore and expand ideas of results-based accountability strategies and investigate solutions that imagine new systems capable of undergirding a just economy, and highlight the transformative power of culture to bring about the changes that we seek. So I would like to introduce you to our amazing panelists. Now, the first panelist I'm going to introduce is super cool because we went to high school together. Can you imagine that? And now here we are. I'm not going to say how many years later, but still here in our city, making the kinds of changes that we dreamed of at Eleanor McMain Magnet High School. So Sean Barney is the managing director of CLB Porter LLC, a real estate development and public finance advisory firm. He's also a partner with Fallberg Properties, a real estate partnership focused on opportunities in Northwest Arkansas. He has structured or developed over $1 billion in projects. How's that from a young man from McMain, right? Sean co-founded the Campaign for Equity New Orleans, conversations for systems leaders and influencers about racial equity. The effort is ongoing with over 1,000 leaders having participated to date and has led to similar initiatives in other communities, including Kansas City, Cleveland, and Northwest Arkansas, as well as corporations such as Walmart, hosting their own internal dialogues about race. Sean serves on various civic boards, including New Orleans Startup Fund and Prospect New Orleans, U.S. Tricentennial. He is a member of the Urban Land Institute, where he was nominated to the Public-Private Partnership Council. He earned a Bachelor of Business Administration Finance from Howard University and a Master of Business Administration from Tulane University's Freeman School of Business. Sean is a fellow of the inaugural class of the Civil Society Fellowship, a partnership of ADL and the Aspen Institute, and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. So thank you so much, Sean, for agreeing to this conversation with us today.
You could have left it at just alumni of McMain with you, but that was all good.
That's how I feel a lot of times too, but for the rest of the people. Yes, McMain prepared us well. And so now I'd like to introduce you to Gregory Price, PhD, who I've not had the honor of meeting yet, but have been very impressed with what I've read of his work, and so excited to, you know, pick his brain about some of these topics that he has delved into on behalf of our folks. So he is the professor of economics at the University of New Orleans. His previous appointments include the interim dean of the School of Business at Langston University, Charles E. Merrill Professor and Chair, Department of Economics at Morehouse College, Director of the Mississippi Urban Research Center, Professor of Economics at Jackson State University, and Economics Programs Director at the National Science Foundation. He's also served as the president of the National Economic Association in 2008. He's an applied, you're gonna have to help me with this word, Baba. Econometrician?
Econometrician.
Okay, all right. See, that's what you know is heavy. And a theorist. His current research interests include economic Now, see, I'm not often thrown for words.
Anthropometry.
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 Yes. Now you have to definitely explain what that one is to us. The economics of historically Black colleges and universities and the effects of race on economic stratification and the causes and consequences of slavery. His research has been published in a wide variety of journals, such as Economics and Human Biology, Review of Black Political Economy, Review of Economics and Statistics, American Economic Review, and Review of Development Economics. A native of New Haven, Connecticut, Dr. Price earned his BA in economics from Morehouse and completed his economics doctorate at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Thank you so much, Dr. Price, for being with us today. And then we have Dr. Torren Sanders, who I do have the honor of being familiar with his work, being a direct beneficiary of an ecosystem that he has greatly contributed to in terms of the education and infusing equity in education in New Orleans. And so it's an honor to be on this panel with you, Dr. Sanders, and looking forward to delving into our work at Ashe together a lot more deeply too. So Dr. Sanders is a licensed clinical social worker, an ordained minister, an experienced family therapist, parent educator, mediator, and mentor trainer. For over 24 years, he served as the pastor of Sixth Baptist Church, organized in 1858. Dr. Sanders earned his bachelor's from Howard University and both his master's and PhD in social work from Tulane. He currently serves as an associate professor at the Millie M. Charles School of Social Work at Southern University at New Orleans. Prior to becoming a pastor, Dr. Sanders was a family preservation therapist, the supervisor of the Parent-Child Center at Kingsley House, coordinator of the Louis Armstrong Manhood Development Program at Milne Boys Home, director of the Loss and Survival Team at Children's Bureau, and vice president of programs for Volunteers of America, Greater New Orleans. A frequent guest speaker and presenter, Dr. Sanders is a recipient of numerous awards from organizations including the FBI, Victims and Citizens Against Crime, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, and Rainbow Push. Dr. Sanders was elected as a reform candidate to the Orleans Parish School Board, where he twice served as president and is currently serves on the board of the St. Thomas Health Clinic and the Ethics Review Board of the City of New Orleans. So welcome, Dr. Sanders. Thank you.
Good morning, and nice to be here.
So I took the time to, really delve into your bios a bit, because I think it's important for, as a context for the discussion, the various ways that you all have worked with equity inside of the community and the wide level of strategies that we have to employ, right, in order to implement it. So I want to just now get into this conversation. So first question. So public scholar Andre Perry is widely quoted as saying there is nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism would not fix, right? And accordingly, our history in America demonstrates countless examples of racist obstruction of Black social and economic success. Our American present shows us that we are still obstructed in the same ways. Why do you think it is so difficult for Americans to recognize that the sources of poverty are rooted in American racist culture rather than Black culture? Dr. Sanders, would you mind taking that one off for us first?
Sure. Thank you again, and I'm excited to be a part of such an esteemed panel and such a wonderful event. I want to thank Tulane for having the vision and the tenacity to hold on and actually host this in spite of the pandemic. And welcome to my fellow panelists. So I guess I'll just answer that question. I guess two points. One is the educational perspective. You said, it's widely known, but it's not widely known in terms of a real, true, comprehensive American history, kind of from the viewpoint, from the perspective of the oppressed, of African Americans, of women, of a lot of communities. We have a top-down his story version of history. And so I think, we definitely cannot assume that people know. People don't know, many white folks don't know, white communities don't know that Black veterans were excluded from the GI Bill, and didn't get the education, the tuition and the mortgages that have built a lot of the white middle class today. They don't know, even with Katrina, how, homes were devalued in the lower Ninth Ward compared to Lakeview, and how a whole lawsuit, had to be done. So there's that educational piece. My favorite scholar, W.B. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, wrote about this many years ago, and with Black Reconstruction, and he wrote another book, The World in Africa, where he talked about how there was a concerted, almost conspiratorial collaboration between academia and media to deny this history and to rewrite history so that these things were not understood and known. So we have to underscore that. And even, when I was born in 1965, to tell my age, there was a report, the Moynihan Report, which talked about, the Negro family being a tangle of pathology and not recognizing all the societal factors that led to the state that Black families were in at that time. So we got to deal with the education piece. The other part is the, I'll call, I guess, socio-psychological, because if it's not Black culture or Black people that's responsible for poverty, then it must be the power structure that has been created largely and predominantly by white folks. And then if that recognition, then that means that there has to be some accountability. That means that there were some choices that were made. And let me say it very upfrontly, that poverty is largely a policy choice. There have been policy decisions made, and I'm sure we'll get into that later on, that have enforced this. And I guess I'll reinforce it just simply by saying this, that we have shown in our country that we do know how to reduce poverty. When the war on poverty happened in the early 60s, when Johnson declared it, poverty for the United States was around 22%. By 1970, it was down to 11%. And of course, we know the war on poverty kind of got, another war, Vietnam War took over and other things took over, as well as just fatigue. So we know that we were successful in doing it with intentional policies. We have to maintain those types of policies. Now, there's other policies we can do, but we have to look at that educational aspect and that social psychological aspect of it also.
Excellent. I love that point about the concerted effort between academia and media, and I definitely want to explore that a little later. Sean, I saw you come off mute. What do you have?
Yeah, first of all, thanks to Asali for moderating the panel, and thanks to Tom Leviste and Danielle Broussard for putting this on, and certainly Tulane University for having the courage to do this in a city which I don't like to define as poor, but is sort of resource challenged, because we're rich in many areas, culture, as you know, but we are a research challenged community. I'll answer the question by putting it, my participation here is probably the intersection of what I do for a living in terms of real estate development and the organizing effort we put together that you've been a part of, Dr. Leviste and Danielle as well, about bringing leaders together to deal with structural racism. And I define, equity in terms of power. Who has it and how are you using it, and who doesn't have it? And if you think about it, poor communities and communities of color are under siege by systems and institutions that give them programs, but deprive them of power, right? And, in my work, equity and power sort of means reframing problems and determining solutions with sort of a racial equity lens. And so what does that mean? So we're developing a big, project along the riverfront, 39 acres. Basically, it's a new neighborhood adjacent to the convention center. And, I've been pushing very hard as one of the development partners, one of the owners of the project, to use, my power, my influence, it's my deal, I'm a partner in it, but to reframe it as an equitable development. And what does that mean? Well, it means what we say it means, right? It means, equity at the ownership level. It means, who participates in the procurement and the design and the construction, but it also means the program. Are we elevating culture? That area was where the original cotton district was. So there should be some acknowledgement of that. The over Market Street was where the slave market was. So what is the acknowledgement of that? Are we making sure that we have not only an appropriate amount of affordable housing, but that we go beyond knowing the needs of our community for affordable housing? So part of what we mean by using your power is that everybody has sort of an ownership in sort of this issue. And so I think that that is something to take a look at. And the only other point I want to elevate for the group is, part of what we talk about in the Campaign for Equity New Orleans work is we use an analogy, a fish in a lake analogy, as you know, to sort of talk about who are we focusing on? Because your question about is it Black culture, the inference is something's wrong with Black people, right? And that if we fix Black people, then, instead of the systems, then that is really the solve. And so we use this lake and a fish analogy, and we sort of say, borrowed from the Racial Equity Institute, you say, if you have a lake and you have a dead fish that floats to the top, you say, what's the matter with the fish? But if you have a lake and all of the fish float to the top, you say, what's the matter with the lake? And then if you go, to the economic development lake, and you go to the health lake and the education lake, all of a sudden you realize you have a groundwater problem. And that's the metaphor to say, just as the panel is talking about, are we working on systems? Are we working on people? Are we working on Black culture? Are we working on American culture? And I think that is the center of the question, and helps us frame up that, it's a structural issue, institutional issue, systemic issue, not a people, a Sean, a Solly, a Greg, a Torren sort of issue. So I think if we focus on this notion of power and who has it and how are we using it, I think that will help us with the general issue, but help us in New Orleans as we try and tackle it as well.
Okay, so let me chime in. So the question is, of course, why is it difficult for Americans to recognize that the problem is in American culture? So I want to make 2 points. First of all, our identities and our perceptions of what the world is contingent upon the time we're born. Second point is that the status of individuals is transmitted across time and space. Okay, there's a correlation between the status of parents and offspring that we observe as far back as the 13th century in medieval England, for example. There's work on that there. So in other words, if your father and your grandfather before him were a ditch digger, there's a high probability you're also going to be a ditch digger. Now, if we look at the initial status of Black Americans, slavery required for its justification that it was subhuman, had a low status. That status was transmitted across time and space, although current individuals have no knowledge or recognition of what happened in that distant past. Status is transmitted across time and space. So in this condition, now putting everybody back on their calculus bicycle, think of a differential equation, think of the solutions, and don't worry about what it is, but it depends upon its initial conditions. The initial condition of American Negro slavery has effects today and will do so in the far distant future. No one knows that. So status is transmitted.
Thank you for that very excellent point, and it actually leads me into my next question. So, while this is true of, most urban places, I think in our local context, it is like so completely and absolutely true that the communities who experience our worst socioeconomic impacts concurrently provide the basis for our public and private wealth. In New Orleans and Louisiana, we concentrate much on the vast disparities between Black and white residents because they are many and they are large. But how do these structural disparities lead to the vast social economic disparities between Louisiana and the rest of the country? How does our entrenched racism, lead to us being the second poorest state in the nation, entrenching our poverty? Dr. Price, if you would pick that up.
Yeah, one quick response to that there is that when you look at Louisiana, like the rest of the former states of the Confederacy, these were states that had a high density of slaves. As we speak now, Louisiana is approximately 32% Black, and that's persisted historically. So think about the density of low status we observed in 1864. Given spatial constraints upon movement, you would expect that to persist. A high density of disadvantaged, stigmatized, viewed as less than human segment of the population, it persists across time. So when you compare black-white outcomes in Louisiana relative to say what they are in a low-density state like Rhode Island, you'll see the disparities vary accordingly. Okay, so that's one way to rationalize that there, right? The density of the slave population at emancipation. Okay, yeah.
Another piece of it, Asali, we did a study called the New Orleans Groundwater to sort of take a look at the data that was out there and the makeup of the workforce. And we discovered many things. Hospitality is one of the dominant sectors in New Orleans, of course, but the employment is sort of like a pyramid. The higher you get to the top, the wider it becomes. So a large share of the labor and the makeup of that particular sector, right, looks Black, but the ownership, the front of house, the staff is really white. That was just one general observation. But when you look at the data, it also looks at, white workers earn 73% of all wages and make up only 59% of the working age population. On average, a white worker in New Orleans metro area makes $1.87 for every dollar earned by a non-white worker. So there is this tremendous disparity, on the earning side, right? That's reflected in a majority Black city. And then, a lot of that is also driven, by the disparities in where people work when you sort of look at the share of industry. So again, I know we'll get to solutions in part of it, but what I like to do as a numbers person is how do you sort of dissect and attack the data to sort of understand, where the problems and the deficiencies are. And I think as Dr. Price is saying, it's not by accident, systems and institutions are designed to produce a certain outcome. And so, I don't know that you quite call it an apartheid economy where, power is concentrated by a minority of folks in New Orleans, but there is no doubt that the data bears out that the concentration of wealth and or power demographically at the top is white, and Black folks who have numbers, make up the foundation in the bottom. And as America becomes a browner nation, you sort of wonder, all right, how is the demographic shift and change going to be handled? And, I think Louisiana is somewhat instructive as to, a direction it could go if we're not careful and we're not focused. So I think looking at the data in our community and how do we sort of pull some of those threads to really understand that the distribution, the economics are distributed really unequally, but also by race. And the only other point I would make is I so appreciate your framing about the question, sort of New Orleans is got many different ethnicities and races, but the sort of racial arrangement in America and certainly in New Orleans is bookended by Black and white. Everybody else sort of slots in between there, but everybody sort of knows when you come to America, you're trying to get closer to the top, and typically that's white folks and moving away from Black folks who are the bottom. But we were constitutionally embedded in this arrangement, right? And Native American folks were wiped out completely. So I just appreciate the framing is not to ignore any other, communities and or races, but it seems like it's like bookends hold your books together. Black and white hold the racial arrangement together. And it's, I think, important to understand, how we all sort of fit in there. So.
Yeah.
Let me point out that Louisiana,
Go ahead.
other southern states were prior to emancipation would depend upon low status slave labor. After emancipation, that persisted, right? So New Orleans basically split the agglomeration from low status labor, service sector. I'd be willing to bet money, and of course I could be wrong on this. If I were to interview all the workers in the hospitality sector, there's a high probability that their parents and their parents before them did the same type of work. Hence the transmission of that status, starting in slavery, low status labor, that persists. And regional economies in the South specialize in that, right? So Newport, Rhode Island looks different from New Orleans. Both have deep ports, but you don't see Newport did not develop like New Orleans, for example, Rhode Island.
If I could just make a point to illustrate what you're saying, you know, if you go to the historic New Orleans collection today and look at the records that shows the people that were enslaved by the hotels, you'll find a lot of the same names and families in those records that, you know, you find today. And just to add a point to the data point that Sean shared, you know, I do a lot of my work in the Claiborne corridor communities, which, you know, make up the majority of the historically Black neighborhoods in New Orleans. And in that community, we make up 19% of the city's population, but 42% of the city's workforce, right? Because we don't have access to the regional higher wage jobs. So when you juxtapose that against white workers, you know, being 59% of the population and making 73% of the wages, and Black workers in that particular community being 19% of the population, but 42% of the workforce, like there's some tremendous shifts that need to happen. Dr. Sanders, please weigh in.
Yeah. Your question, you know, you posed, you know, Louisiana versus the rest of the country, and which was a great way to look at it. And two things. One, I think, you know, the political will or lack thereof needs to be highlighted. Many of us have probably heard Reverend Andrew Young, a former mayor of Atlanta, or our former mayor, Mark Morial, talk about this when you look at Atlanta versus New Orleans. And of course, it was their mayor, Maynard Jackson, back in the 70s, I believe it was, with the Atlanta airport expansion. And he said to the white community, the white business community, look, you could have 75% of something or 100% of nothing. Meaning that 25% of that business was going to go to Black businesses. And so that took, and he said they didn't believe him. And it took a while, and he had to like repeat it a few times. And then it was like, oh, for real? So, all right, let's do it. And then that carried over later on when Atlanta got the Olympics, and Black businesses were a substantial portion of doing the Olympic work in terms of the construction and other aspects. So I think in Louisiana, we still lack the political will to get away. And my fellow Howardite, Sean, called it apartheid. I'm gonna call it a Confederate mentality. You know, the Confederacy mentality is still very mindset, and those practices are still very much there. The last thing I'll say is, you know, there's a video on YouTube that Together Baton Rouge put together, an organization, a civic group put together that I'm a part of, Together New Orleans, and it's called Why Louisiana Stays Poor. And the point that it makes real briefly is that Louisiana is not a poor state. It has resources that are being poorly used, and finances that are being hoarded in terms of corporate subsidies by major players. But I mean, we are at the top in terms of oil refining, sugar production, our port. I mean, there's money here. It's just not getting put out to the people. In fact, those tax exemptions were supposed to then be able to benefit people so they can get good jobs and get access to quality roads and education, but it's not happening. So we have to look at that aspect also in terms of the political will and then how it manifests in terms of government policy or lack thereof.
Sally, can I jump on that point too? Because I thought Greg and Torren made two great points I just wanted to amplify. You know, we sort of talk about in the CINO work that systems contribute significantly to disparities. And I heard both Torren and Greg say this, right? In terms of, you know, a focus on the hospitality sector. And we always talk about our inability to diversify, as Torren is saying, you know, poorly distributed, you know, resources or policies, or not, you know, the city of New Orleans wants to raise the minimum wage, the state of Louisiana and the legislature saying, no, we're not going to let you. So systems contribute significantly to disparities. And I'd also say socioeconomic difference doesn't explain the differences. A lot of folks want to go there, but if you look at a lot of the data in education or health, where white folks with less education in many cases have better outcomes than Black folks with PhDs. We know about, infant mortality is certainly one amongst Black women where that is sort of teased out, and we've seen evidence of that. And the third thing I would say that we talk about is racial inequity looks the same across all systems. And that, goes to the health system I alluded to. It goes to the juvenile justice system, the education system. We saw this up close with COVID and the effects that were there. So when you really look at that, racial inequity looks the same across systems, the socioeconomic difference doesn't explain it, and systems contributing, you really realize that you have a systemic sort of issue. And it is not, going to your opening point, an issue with, Black folks or Black culture when you put all that together. So I thought both those guys made the point, wanted to tease that out.
Yes, definitely. And I'm going to just say how much I love this panel, because you all always lead into my next question. It's almost like magic. So to your point, Sean, we know that inequity and its impacts have not occurred overnight. They are, in fact, as old as our nation is. To reverse the effects of centuries of disadvantage, we must exert equivalent intentionality, or what my children call come at me with the same energy, right? And commitment to the long-term application of resources for remedying these social, political, and economic injustices. What do such magnificent resources look like? And I love to start with the economists on that.
Well, so I'm of the viewpoint, and given that I'm committed to this intergenerational transmission of status framework, I think a suitable answer would be a policy of reparations. I mean, basically, if you look at the loss in status that is a consequence of chattel slavery, we can actually estimate the dollar value of that there. So I think reparations would make whole the dynamic trajectory of inequality that was experienced by the descendants of American Negro slaves. So that's a broad policy prescription. Now the specifics back can be worked out, but I think reparations is the only, because let me also point out the following: that I become skeptical. I mean, post-emancipation, all these race-specific policy interventions, such as affirmative action and others, have not been effective in reducing Black-white inequality. They have not. They just haven't. So I think a policy of reparations is probably ideal. Okay, reparations. Yeah.
Just to add more of a point to it, yes to reparations. How much?
Yeah, well, the estimates range. They range from, I've seen them as high as $18 trillion on a per person basis to 5 million. We haggle about that. It becomes very technical, but yeah, I mean, we can get the number. It would be substantial. It would be substantial enough to make whole, to repair the trajectory of inequality that followed post-emancipation. Yeah. So I can't commit to. I have a favorite number. I mean, but
I got a number, Asada.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Well, we had a study done. I don't know if folks could see it, but we looked at it and put it together. And there is roughly in New Orleans, anywhere from a $5 billion, gap in terms of GDP between Black and white to, if you look at the policy link analysis, Altram, up to 19 billion. And I think that, some of my friends are afraid of what they call the R word, the reparations or whatnot. But I think it's a lack of imagination if folks think about, how that can manifest itself, right? And I think that part of the way it happens is when you talk about things like, free college tuition, or, we sort of talk about healthcare. When you again get into sort of the policy prescriptions and where those policies and resources are targeted, that to me becomes, a 21st century way to really operationalize this, notion of reparations, or what I would call sort of atonement, right? For an acknowledgement of a historic wrong. And when you sort of talk about the history of this country, And, it being, almost 250 years old, it really, we were born in the 70s, Asali. It really was just the century, the decade before, it was still legal to discriminate against people that look like us. I mean, you really just think about that. In the lifetime of, our parents, effectively, it was legal to do that. So my policy prescription is really continue to do battle on this history front, and really to sort of, as Torren said, to pull back the covers on what history has looked like, and how it has been policies that have disadvantaged people of color, and I think most people, Black and white, have no idea. I mean, we sort of look at this thing as slavery and then a dash and then the civil rights movement, and now, well, there's a lot of stuff that happened during that dash, right? I mean, a ton of stuff when you sort of talk about giving a little bit of advantage to one group and a little bit of disadvantage to another group. Well, I'm a finance guy. I like to say advantage compounds just like interest, and so when you have, a little bit of advantage and, a little bit of disadvantage, that turns up in the history of people today. I'll just give you a quick example in my world, how that does. As I mentioned to you, we're doing a project on the commit by the riverfront. And, in real estate development, you have to put up a little money and you have to guarantee a lot of money. And, the ability to guarantee, to do a deal, to carry the weight in your deal is not really reflected on Sean today. It really is on the balance sheet of my father and my father's father. So when my dad, born in Lutcher, Louisiana in 1934, eventually went to Southern and Tulane and MIT, but the opportunities when he was, graduating college in 1950s or whatever were different than guys I do business with today. But when we go to sign, all of that history, through no fault of theirs, certainly no fault of mine, manifests itself today in what the economic opportunities look like. So I think whether you do well or you don't do well, that history shows up today, and it is something I think we need to continue to reveal. And then I think folks will understand just how rigged the game has ultimately been when that reveals itself.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I'll add to that, I mean, first I want to say amen to reparations. I completely agree, and I'll kind of half jokingly say, if I could just wipe out my income taxes for the rest of my life, I'd be all right. So that's one way for some people, I think, huh? But I think seriously, I go back to the political will and representation right here in Louisiana, right? The governor just vetoed those bogus redistricting maps. To deny rightfully this state a second majority Black district. It's things like that where people are still playing Confederate games that's denying us of a true equity in our state, and then ultimately in the country. It brings to mind, I believe, one of our civil rights leaders in the 60s, and they went to Johnson and they told him everything that was needed. And then he said, I agree with you, go out and make me do it, and we still have to be willing to go out and make them do it. And so, with that political organization will is a great resource that we still have to tap into. And then I'll just say also, someone mentioned like higher education. And Sean mentioned, free college, and that's a wonderful thing. But even, in the last 10 years or so, there's been major changes in funding of higher education in terms of the ability to get loans on the behalf of Black families. And that's, has it really impacted a lot of Black youth going to college. But when I went to college, if they needed to get a loan for me, my parents could have easily just signed a loan. The criteria wasn't as stringent. But now you got to really have good credit to get a loan for your child to go to college. And so you have that, and yet not everybody needs to go to college or wants to, but for those who do it and everything, that has also a major impact. So we need to look at things like that, as well as, of course, during the pandemic, and the bill was passed to expand the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and the Child Tax Credit, which did lift millions of people out of poverty, if at least for that period, which we're still fighting for now to see whether it will be extended and for how long. But those things have made a great impact. And again, let me just say again, we do know how in our country to fight poverty. We did do it. We did do it during the war on poverty. It was working, and it was stopped. And so let us not be fooled that we don't. It's a mystery. We do know how to do it, and that array of programs did have an impact. It decreased poverty by at least by 50% at that time. So I just wanted to go on record with that again.
Excellent. I'm so excited. Well, first of all, I also want to get a shout out to playing Confederate games. And I want to add to that on a colonial playing field, right? We hosted a reparations conference just this past weekend here at Ashe. So I'm super excited to have this reparations conversation, come up here. And some of the things that that policy makers have been doing, like some of the early policy decisions around equity are happening. So like Evanston, Illinois has made an ordinance that immediately adds $25,000 in equity to every Black homeowner. So things like that that are happening, that are really data driven. To Sean's point about the importance, of our integrity and fidelity to collecting data and, actualizing it. And that also leads me, into, again, the next question. So there are many seemingly entrenched disparities in our city, including a 25-year difference in life expectancy, which to me is the most dramatic and traumatic, particularly since I have 5 children that I'm raising in New Orleans. And I think that my children deserve to live just as long in the 7th Ward as children in Lakeview do. And now COVID, they're saying that might be a 30-year difference. Well, in our work, we've learned that achieving measurable strides toward equity requires scopes of work that are bold in their approach and cast nets that are both deep and wide. It needs engaged participants using a racial reconciliation framework to focus on specific topics, gleaning critical feedback to inform program design and decision-making. Qualitative and quantitative assessments of project impact must be made in order to meet long-term strategic goals. How do we build the social, institutional, and especially political capacity to take on this work? And Dr. Sanders, I'd like to throw that back to you.
Sure. And I love your questions. Let's give a big virtual hand for those questions. Wonderful questions. I guess the only thing, and it's not with you and your question, but that word reconciliation, and we talk about racial reconciliation, and I hate that because I think it's about racial conciliation. When was the time when we were already reckoned together? And so I think it's about racial. How do we figure out how to finally come together on some basis of equality and equity, which we have never done in our country, as we all know, given our history. And so, and that brings to mind, again, Sean talked about apartheid, and, in South Africa, when apartheid was over, what Bishop Tutu, I think was called upon to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so before there can be reconciliation or conciliation, there has to be truth telling, which gets back to your first question, right? In terms of education. And, we have to come on, maybe not agree on everything, but we have to tell the whole truth about what has happened. I know, if I get into an argument with my wife and then I want to make up, and she was like, well, what you making up for? What did you do? and I got to confess, right? I got to confess what I did wrong that I shouldn't have done. And it's the same thing. We need confession, we need truth telling, and then there's a foundation for real conciliation and or reconciliation. And then we got to set mutual terms of engagement from now on. So how are we going to deal with each other, right? And of course, also all of that then necessitates that we got to actually talk to each other. Black folks and white folks have to talk to each other. And we have to talk about, as Sean said, about power. It's not just about, I want to get to know, if you like to play tennis or golf, but how are we dealing with this power dynamic in our city and in our state? And are you willing to deal with that openly and honestly? In what ways are you still exercising power? In what ways do you not even realize how you're contributing to the continuation or perpetuation of some old Confederate practices? And so at my church, Sixth Baptist, we've been in conversation with Trinity Episcopal Church on Jackson Avenue, one of the most oldest, wealthiest, of more affluent congregations in the city, with Sixth Baptist Church, formed by slaves and freedmen in 1858. And so having those dialogues, and that needs to be replicated throughout the city, which I think Sean is going through his.
Jump in to say that
Yes.
the Episcopalian Church has made a statement about reparations, like a global statement, and has dug into that work, about sharing their power and their resources. So continue.
That's right. No, you're right. So there's an interest there now, but it needs to be then made real. And then with that, investment needs to happen. Money. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, let me jump on that, because I'm gonna pull on the spiritual theme there. You can't, confession comes before atonement, right, Pastor? I mean, so we all this stuff about reconciliation, I need the confession first. That has to happen. And the other thing I like to tell people is you can't have race neutral solutions for a race-based problem. And I think that is kind of what we think, is that we had a Black president who I loved and had a fan of. People used to tell us when we had Jindal, we had an Indian governor, we had white mayor, like we're post-racial. And obviously we've realized in the last 4 or 5 years that isn't the case. But this question of power, I want to come back to it, because you think about it with the criminal justice and law enforcement, Black folks get law and order, white folks get protect and serve, right? And so, it's this notion of you can have a same system, but how, it is applied to certain groups of people and or certain neighborhoods is totally different. And so to me, really just keeping a lens on, this notion of, structural racism is not something, that, a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it's been a feature sort of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. I mean, it's not as somebody said, it's not the bug, it's the feature. And I think, as you said, Pastor, that, having really working on folks understanding that, the why, and recognizing why things are the way that they are, is to me such a foundational to all of the work that we're doing, because you can't fix what you can't see. And so I think that, there's been this masterful job in our country of, by design, not wanting to see. And I think that the debate about critical race theory, and we all know that's just a boogeyman, but we're seeing that ultimately play out again, right? Where people are passing laws so you can't see. And so I'm amazed by it, but I also think therein sort of lies the opportunity, because if you look at the history of recoveries, after crisis in this country, post Great Depression, post World War II, those events sort of shook up the way we valued economic and social contributions. However, the way those recoveries were designed ultimately doubled down on the racial caste system instead of chipping away at it, right? The Social Security Act of 1935 did not extend coverage to farm or domestic workers, disproportionately excluded, Blacks from its benefits. When you think about the ARPA, the COVID-19 sort of payments that came out, and which workers were, ineligible for that. A lot of gig workers, right? A lot of gig workers are disproportionately people of color. So we see that act playing out again. The New Deal legislation made available $120 billion worth of trillions a day in loans. As Torren said, 98% of that went to white people. The GI Bill of 1944, 95 billion of opportunities went to white GIs, although in theory, Black GIs were eligible for it, but didn't receive it. So to me, this notion of the opportunities that a recovery brings. And we're going to be in extended recovery after COVID. And there's going to be a lot of talk about Ukraine, and I think justifiably so in terms of support and what happens. But I think that helps to help still reframe the conversation, is that recovery is an opportunity to chip away or to double down. And I think for our community in New Orleans, and we released, CINO did, and I'll go over them at some point, but in 2020, the 6 rules for very short and equitable recovery of post-COVID. And it's obvious we're going to be in a long-term, sort of recovery. But recoveries historically have presented opportunities for us. And instead of going through one door, we inevitably have gone through another door. So can we change that history?
So let me chime in with a little, first of all, with a cliche. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Now, one way to build that institutional power capacity to address these problems, of course, is to hold accountable your public universities for production of knowledge that can solve these problems. And let me get particular here. University of New Orleans, in a city that's 6% Black, I'm the only Black economist he ever hired. Tulane University only recently hired a Black economist, my colleague Gary Hoover, who will be in a symposium elsewhere. LSU has never, ever hired a Black economist in a state that's 30% Black. Now, what does that mean? Well, it can mean many things. Many, of course, it aborts the production of knowledge that might be useful to solving some of these problems. Suggesting that the academy doesn't prioritize racial inequality. It suggests that, right? That type of work. So I would urge that taxpayers, at least, hold their public college universities accountable for the production of knowledge and curriculum that address these problems, right? That allows a space for Black scholars and others who are partisan to these issues to serve that function, to produce the knowledge, right? Universities have to be held accountable, should be held accountable at some point. I mean, how does LSU get away with never having a Black economist ever? UNO and Tulane only recently resolved this problem within the past 2 years.
You're such a man of short words. I'm wanting you to say more.
Well, yeah. But no, that's part of the problem. The production of knowledge. I mean, solving these problems requires knowledge. What are the effects of these causes? What are the causes of effects? Yeah.
And
we need Black scholars. We need more Black scholars engaged with these issues.
We need Black scholars holding those public spaces accountable, but also, like when we're talking about this distribution of resources, how much resources have been withheld from our historically Black colleges and universities, right? Conversely, with the white land grant institutions and, the effects of that, that have rolled down in there just now. I went to school in Tennessee, and my daughter's in school there now, and they're just starting to talk about returning money, in the UT system, to Tennessee State and to the, Black schools that have been, like they show how they've kept their money, right, over these years.
You're well aware of Southern University of New Orleans, their chronic underfunding over the years. How come they're not funded adequately to have an economics department and to have a research capacity? It's been neglected by the state of New Orleans, right? Yeah.
And look, and I would even say, I say this as a Tulane alum, and I've said this to Tulane as well, if Xavier, I think this past year got the largest private contribution they've ever received, $10 million. And, if Xavier could do in business and education what they've been doing with kids in the sciences, how far advanced would New Orleans be? So that's just my backhanded way of basically saying, given to Tulane an incremental contribution or whatnot, that probably goes a longer way going to Xavier, which pays a bigger dividend in New Orleans. That's a complicated thing to say, but if we're serious about this, then it's one thing for Pastor Sanders to work with Trinity Church. It's another thing for Tulane and Xavier to basically say, we're going to enter into a long-term partnership to sort of increase the resources that are coming into Xavier University versus Tulane, which takes a lot of kids from out of town, and they leave and go out of town, where Xavier takes a lot of local kids and they end up staying here and investing in a community. So that's a complicated conversation. We're talking about a complicated topic. And so to me, partnerships at the institutional level, I love with Dr. Price said, my father was the first Black chairman of LSU's Board of Supervisors. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to raise that issue with my friends who are on the board over at LSU and say, why is that the case? That's using my power and my proximity, right? But I think we have to put pressure on those organizations. But I think we got to call a thing and say, as a Tulane alum, getting $100 million contributions, that'll never, I won't say it'll never happen. I just think that partnership is something, thinking creatively at the institutional levels is something that, is really, can pay serious dividends is what I'll just leave it at that.
And to, highlight the points that you have been making all along, for such a partnership, right? Which is complex and could possibly be so brilliant, that truth and reconciliation, right, still has to come at the institutional level to talk about, the history of Tulane and why it is in the advantaged position that it's in and its early policies, right, that contributed to the racial ecosystem in our city as a whole and still contribute in many ways that only Tulane would have the ability to dismantle at that same institutional level. And also highlighting the fact of boards and commissions, there should be no first and only Blacks on boards and commissions in the state of Louisiana, much less the city of New Orleans. However, we still do have over 100 boards and commissions in this city, many of which do not represent Black folks, and certainly none of which represent poor folks, right? And so those are the kinds of systemic things that need to change too, right? If we are going to see these policies dismantle. And so to highlight the complexity that Sean just brought up, my final question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. I see that there are a couple. So, I started off by saying, I'm a culturalist. So my equity beliefs are really rooted in that. And so as society's most trusted messengers, which I believe that artists and cultural makers are, so we should be considered the most natural allies for policymakers. We're able to learn, interpret, align, and share complex ideas and processes with citizens in ways that exponentially increase understanding and thereby impact. We have proven to be models for advocacy and messaging, healthy workplace culture, transparency in government processes, and transformative community partnership. How do we activate this intrinsic value of artists and culture bearers in new ways that lead to economic parity?
I'll say simply, first, we need to fund it and we need to fund them. I know I love now the conversation about the cultural economy and taking that seriously, and it's recognizing the contribution of culture bearers to our economy overall. Unfortunately, we know post-Katrina, many of the same people that people come to New Orleans to see were the people getting pushed out, getting green dotted, which was like, so what are we really trying to do in the city here, right? I want to add preachers to that. I don't know if we're culture makers in the same way as a culture bearer, but we talk to people every week, sometimes several times a week, and translate as artists do things in for the masses of people. But unfortunately, faith as well as artists and especially for the Black community, it gets discounted by the larger white community as not essential. And yet it is essential. I just learned this, and if I'm wrong, somebody just please correct me, but I just learned that years ago, I'm not sure if it's the case now, that with regards to copywriting, that something could not be copyrighted unless it was written down. And so it's like, wow, and you think of all the oral tradition of African and African American people, and then to have it written down first. Well, what if you didn't know music? Know how to write music, or if you didn't know how to write at all because of that, but you were so creative, and that led in some ways to the theft of our artistic and cultural product. And so, which is a big deal. My son now is in the music industry himself. He's a music producer. And so I said, first thing you need is get your attorney. Make sure nobody steals your stuff. And so, but we need to fund it. And, a lot of times when we want to get community involvement, we invite community people, and everybody around the table is paid except for the community people. So we need to fund the community people. We need to fund the cultural people so that they too can afford to be at the table and miss some other work so that they can contribute and have their voices heard and felt.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say this. I obviously talked a lot about power, and I think power is important. But as somebody put in the chat, I think the power of narrative is a tremendous leadership tool, and is really an essential aspect of organizational strategy. I was in Amsterdam last week, 2 weeks ago, and the brand of Amsterdam is about, tolerance is what they try. They have the Hague that is there, and the International Criminal Court. And, who knows if they quite get there. As folks know, really, we're trying to shift the brand of New Orleans to being the most equitable city in America. And what does that mean? And what does that mean about the story, we tell ourselves? Narrative is really powerful, because you don't have a self until you have a story about yourself, right? We have all these internal narratives like, who am I? You have family narratives, we have national narratives, we have organizational narratives. So to me, the cultural economy, cultural bearers, just our cultural resources, the richness of it, I think really has an instrumental role to play in defining New Orleans' narrative and what the narrative has been and what it is. When we had our centennial, folks asked me to get involved in the 300-year tricentennial, whatever. I said, for me, the last 300 years haven't been great for everybody. But what I am into is defining what the next 100 years look like for everybody. And what are we going to do about that? And so to me, that power of narrative and narrative change is one that we all have a role to play. But I think, culturalists have a very unique positioning to really provide leadership on in direction and guidance.
Dr. Price?
Yeah, I just want to weigh in. I said, one of the things I think is important, I think we need to find ways to revive the Black critical tradition that we once had up into the 70s, when we had the likes of the Ralph Ellisons, the James Baldwins, the Zora Neale Hurston's, who can launch substantive anti-bourgeois critiques, particularly in Black colleges. The resuscitation of journals like Phylon, where Black anti-bourgeois intellectuals can weigh in substantive critiques, instead of embracing entrepreneurship and IT training. We also need to be mindful that we have a balanced intellectual traditions. Where are these organic Black intellectuals at? Are they all locked up? Are they all dead? Whatever happened to them there? You can't depend upon professional scholars who are, in many cases, just mere careerists to advance knowledge of cause consequence. So we need to find it. So I know this is very broad, but how do we do that? Can we fund the Black critical tradition amongst the literary scholars? Where are the James Baldwins at? Is it Ta-Nehisi Coates? How accessible are they? Where
and in a time when people are not reading, right? They're, subsuming knowledge in different ways. How do we bring that critique, right? Because everybody would have been listening for James Baldwin, in his time. I'm not so sure that everybody's listening for, Mr. Coates in the same ways because of all of the distractions that we have. So how do we, use artists to get past that? And
so that's more descriptive, but how do we recover that? But I think it's important for the cultural production of ideas as well, too, for them to be involved, and not to cede this to strictly careerist eggheads who are merely trying to get tenure. Right?
Well, that's that, collaboration that was mentioned earlier, the effort between academia and media, right? Like if we had a partnership between academia and media in our cultural sense, not media in the mass consumption sense, but that could target these kinds of messages and motivations, and what are the things that get people to civic participation, right? What are the things that get people to put the kinds of pressure on their legislators, on that gets them to hold their university system accountable, you know, and all of those things. But I am kindly and gently reminded that we have questions in the audience. And so I do want to honor that, because I will talk to y'all, and maybe we'll have another time to do that over dinner at Ashe some night. I'll talk to y'all all night. All right, audience question. I live in the Lower Ninth Ward, and I'm seeing that all the homes are being remodeled by white people. What are we doing to give Black people more chances to take advantage of the programs for home ownership? And will we ever be given the power to remake our own communities? Does our developer expert want to weigh in on that?
Sure. So, I can't speak specifically to what's happening in the 9. My family grew up on Andrew Street and Flood. And so we, know that area well. I live in the Upper 9th Ward, or Bywater these days, on Royal. So I know the area well. I think that there is, we looked at a project in Central City, Brown's Dairy, some time ago last year. I think there's a push for home ownership, and without getting too much in the weeds, going back to the policy angle, New Orleans was sort of founded as a city of doubles. You live on one side and rent out the other side, was kind of how you paid your note. And over time, as housing inventory got tight, people started converting doubles over to singles. So there's a lack of inventory of doubles. And our idea was to really focus on home ownership by bringing back, doubles and allowing affordable home ownership. Well, the regulation from bankers basically says that you don't get credit for the rental income when you apply for the mortgage. So the cost to build the home, the folks you're trying to target at a certain AMI of 80% or so or below, they need credit for that income that comes from the doubles. So I say that to say that even when private sector folks are interested in trying to deliver, good solutions that have sort of an economic return, the policy piece has to be there to, grease the skids for that to happen. But, I know the city has been promoting some of those, affordable home ownership programs. I think the policy has to be caught up. And frankly, to the question, the elected officials have to be versed enough in the issues that they're trying to solve. And that's not an indictment of elected officials. They have a lot coming at them, but a lot of times they just don't know the nuance that's there. So in theory, there is a affordable home ownership initiative and or program, but it doesn't work because there's a technicality from the lending community that does not allow it to work. Thus, you have only people who have independent resources, and there's a lot of resources out there. Stock market is up. The interest rates are historically, low. People are aging in place. So I give you that to say that there's going to continue to be, I think, an issue where people have cash, historically have cash, can come in and buy up these properties on the cheap, unless there is an intervention, I think, from local government authorities, not only on, the demand side, but on the supply side, understanding how housing trust funds can sort of play a role. That's a long answer to say that I think, there's no one simple solution to that, but I think it starts with your elected officials, and you have elected official representing the Lower Ninth Ward who's been there before, and Oliver Thomas, who knows his way around. And so, I don't know what his pushes are or what his interests are from a elected standpoint, but he certainly is capable of having, done a tour of duty once before and is now back in his seat. So that may be a good place to start with him.
I'll posit, Dr. Sanders, before you begin, that's actually an excellent place to start. When I mentioned our reparations panel this past weekend, we premiered a short play written by Kathy Randalls, but starring Oliver Thomas, that I directed on reparations. And we will be doing that play again at the Tennessee Williams Festival on March 26th at 11 a.m. if anyone would care to check it out. Dr. Sanders, go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, Sean has covered a whole lot of the territory, and I don't consider myself an expert in housing by any means, but I will throw out the word gentrification, and which is a part of this discussion. And I don't even like that word. I like calling it Black removal, and because that's what it is. That's the impact of it. And I think much of the answer is with our locally elected officials. Because my question is, well, how was that home, available? And so we have to look at how property taxes have been allowed to rise and run people out of their homes. And that can be dealt with via government. And then also, as development, market rate development is being done, how can we, have then affordable housing as a key element of those packages at substantial levels in recognition of the nature of the problem. There was a report done recently by one of the housing organizations that showed how much we don't have in terms of affordable housing. So our policy needs to be
how much we do have in terms of housing stock, right?
That's right. That's right. And so policy needs to be commensurate with the problem. You can't take Tylenol for cancer, so to speak, right? We need a policy that's commensurate. So that's all I'll offer with
Sally, can I hit just very quick on one other point, because it's so hit home for me. Part of it is on the policy side and understand the history of policies and how they have disadvantaged certain people and how we've taken Black people's property, right? So you have tax adjudication sales. My mother's 85 in a wheelchair in Baton Rouge. She called me to pay her tax bill or something like that, and went down there. It's in a tax sale, and she's paying it late, but paying it. But the process of when it went into the tax sale is now, you're competing with this person who now has a title to your property. Of course, the penalties and interest and all that. And, this is a woman that's got, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, but she's an 85-year-old woman, a senior, removed from her property. So how the policies, that's sort of a race neutral policy, but I bet you, as we're making bets, as Greg Price said, I bet you that policy disproportionately affects people of color. So we have to be in tune with those things. It sounds like a good government piece, pay your taxes or whatever, pay them on time, and they will be. But how do those policies, again, disproportionately affect certain people and exacerbate the issues that we're sort of talking about here?
Yeah, and I would posit that no policy is race neutral. And as we're coming to the end, Dr. Price, I'm going to let you have the last word, but I just want to call out the question that is in the first, the end of the first question was, when will we ever be given the power to remake our own communities? And I would venture to say, on behalf of these distinguished guests, that we already have that power. It's a matter of marshaling it and using it to hold our leaders accountable. And the next question is, isn't the current misguided, contrived outrage over teaching critical race theory one of a number of ways, such as suppressing voting rights, that white people are now using to fight to keep their power? They keep putting up roadblocks. Dr. Price, tell us, how do we move forward?
Well, we move forward by engaging in critical resistance. I mean, and the primacy of ideas, and basically taking charge of prioritizing what we think are important. The academy, for example, is supposed to be open and free. That's why it's important to keep public academies, institutions, K-12 accountable for what is taught, what constitutes knowledge, and what should be prioritized. So we shouldn't back down in face of opposition. Opposition is how progress proceeds. So keep fighting, keep fighting. Do not back down. Yeah.
That's right, because when we dare to struggle, as our great philosopher has told us, we dare to win. And I would like to suggest that the continuation of this panel, because I'm going to claim a continuation, that we discuss what accountability, looks like in some detail, because we talked a lot about that. But what are things, because I'm seeing some more questions in the Q&A that lets me know that there are many in our community who are looking for some strategies in hand that they can put to action right now. And so I would love to have that conversation with you guys. And I also want to take this moment to thank Dr. Levis and Dr. Broussard so much for inviting us to this space and creating the opportunity for this conversation. I want to thank everybody who's joined us and contributed their energy and their insight and questions. I'm so excited about the rest of this symposium, because we do need some really bold and innovative solutions to dismantle the poverty that is plaguing our community. Sean, Dr. Price, Dr. Sanders, thank you so much. And Aluda continue, we fight on.